Harley Reid dealt with the media and football world's attention unbelievably well in 2024. The West Australian, videos made like mine, and hundreds of articles featured the West Coast young gun's name and face in the build-up to his draft and throughout the season. Reid on field was exceptional, flashing his talent most weeks, and even winning some games for a weak West Coast side. Clearly the club and his family provided a strong support system around him. 15 years ago, a player similar in hype to Reid was swallowed alive, especially by his own club, who hung him up to dry at times. June 8, 2009 was the beginning of Jack Watts' career at Melbourne, and in hindsight was the end of it. The saddest part about Watts' story is that a lot of the issues and problems he faced weren't even his own doing. At the end of 2008, Melbourne needed a saviour. They finished the season last with just 3 wins and with no real hope or talented youth for the fanbase to get excited about. A skinny 17-year-old who measured at 196 centimetres at the draft combine would become the face of the club, whether he liked it or not. Even in year 11, Jack Watts was the name in the draft. The national championships confirm this. 15 goals, All-Australian selection, and the Lark medal as the best player against the best in the country secured Watts' fate. 2008 was the last year a 17-year-old could be picked, and Watts decided to nominate for the national draft, but made it clear he would finish year 12 at Brighton Grammar in 2009 while being at an AFL club. Draft night came, and Watts' name was called out at pick 1. The hype for him built in a different way to Reid. Reid was already blessed the number 1 player in his draft as the season started. In fact, due to injury, Reid didn't have a dominant under-18 year like you would think. Watts was the opposite. His performances at the national championships and testing at the draft combine made him out to be a 17-year-old full forward who could run and jump like a small forward or midfielder. Perhaps the Melbourne Football Club got carried away or needed a poster boy to sell to their fans, or maybe a bit of both, because their initial welcoming for Watts was an induction of monumental pressure. 2 days after being drafted, Watts was presented with the number 4 Guernsey, worn by club legend Norm Smith, who led Melbourne to 10 premierships as a player and coach. By the way, the person who presented him the number 4 was Ron Barassi, who was involved in 6 Melbourne flags as a player. This was more than a creation of hype. This was handing over the expectation of Melbourne's premiership glory days to a 17-year-old still in school. But to be fair, Melbourne took a balanced approach initially. He didn't feature in any pre-season games due to focusing on school, and began the early part of the year in the VFL. He had a few good games and was progressing well. A VFL bye week actually allowed him to play in the APS for Brighton Grammar in a game against Melbourne Grammar, an AFL listed player playing in a school game, something we'll never see again. But then there was a fatal turning point, a career-defining one. As good as Watts was progressing at the lower level, Melbourne were not doing nearly as well in the AFL. By the end of round 10, the D's had won just 1 game, a round 5 matchup against the second worst side in Richmond. That hope and spark was just not there. With pressure on the club and a growing sense of uneasiness with relatively new head coach Dean Bailey, there was only one possible lever to pull. Round 11 was the Queen's Birthday mega clash against Collingwood, and there was no better grand stage to show off the club's number 1 pick. Jack Watts was announced to debut at the MCG in front of 60,000 people. Now he did have back-to-back weeks in the VFL with over 20 disposals and was in good form, but you have to cringe looking back at the footage of Watts running out. He looks like a boy, and it's because he still was one.
What do you remember about that day? not too much. I was a bit rattled there, Mick, but I remember going down by about 10 goals and then heading in to do my accounting exam the next morning. So,
but that specific moment where they came for you, obviously you weren't expecting that.
Nah, look, I think it happens 50 times a game, to be honest. It was fairly blown up afterwards, but yeah, don't remember too much of that.
Watts laughed about it, but it was a brutal first game. Physically and mentally he was targeted, and having an exam the next day just shows how raw Watts was as a football product and a person. The excitement and hype quickly turned to concern and negative media attention. Watts would play a further 2 games at the AFL level in 2009, spending the rest of his time in the VFL. Melbourne would finish last again with 4 wins and 18 losses. This was really when all the turmoil would begin at the club. The next few seasons at Melbourne were just bad. Melbourne finished 12th in 2010, 13th in 2011, and then had 3 straight seasons with at least a bottom 3 place on the ladder. During this time, Dean Bailey was sacked after a 186-point loss to Geelong in round 19 of 2011. Jack Trengrove and Jack Grimes were then made co-captains at incredibly young ages by Mark Neild, who replaced Bailey, although he lasted just 33 games, of which 5 of them resulted in wins, before Paul Roos finally came in 2014 and provided stability. It was a big mess of a club for the first half of Watts' career, and he absolutely fell victim to this. From 2010 to 2013, he was mainly placed forward, but did spend some time in defence. Looking back, Watts performed okay. Did he live up to the mantle of the number 1 pick? No, but he wasn't atrocious. He just wasn't that key forward he was touted as, and didn't have the personality to take on the saviour role. These are things that are hard to predict when interviewing him as a 17-year-old, but were big mistakes made by Melbourne. In reality, Watts played his best more as a half forward. This was seen under a good coach in Roos between 2014 and 2016, where Watts averaged roughly 16 disposals and 5.5 marks per game and kicked 51 goals across 3 seasons. They are respectable numbers, but obviously not one of a superstar. In the moment, he was copying it. Matthew Lloyd, David Schwartz, Mark Robinson and Robert Walls were just some of the big media presences to focus in on Watts between 2010 to 2015. By the time Watts turned 25, the media heat on him did diminish because it did become clear the type of player he was. In an interview with the Resilience Project years later, Watts said, "I was meant to be this saviour that's going to turn the club around," he says. It was a hard couple of years. You get a grace period where you get the benefit of the doubt that you're just developing. But year 2, year 3, other guys from your draft are going off and playing grand finals and playing good footy, and we were still bottom of the ladder. Whether you think it was fair in hindsight that Watts copped a lot of negative feedback when Melbourne was struggling is up to you, but clearly it ruined his confidence and love of football. When it was at its worst, it was relentless. People would say, Melbourne's made the biggest mistake of their time as a club by picking this bloke. Again, we can relate this all the way back to that debut game. Melbourne put out a physically underdeveloped 18-year-old who had an exam the next day, with all the pressure of wearing the number 4 Guernsey. By the end of 2017, Watts was traded to Port Adelaide for pick 31. 2018 saw him average 14 disposals and kick 18 goals in 19 games. The start of 2019 had a bit more promise, with Watts featuring back in defence, gathering 22 disposals and taking 9 marks against Melbourne in a round 1 win, being one of the best players on the ground. But the following week, he ended up breaking his leg and dislocating his ankle against Carlton. He retired at the end of 2020, playing no AFL games in the season. He was just 29 years old. Everything not to do with a number 1 pick was done with Watts. He was way overhyped and given too much responsibility, making him an easy scapegoat. The club threw him out to the wolves when everyone could see he was not ready and the environment around him was unstable and at times toxic. Of course, Watts isn't without responsibility for his own career direction, but it is hard to overcome all of these things. He still played 174 games and kicked 161 goals and had moments of brilliance. Watts' journey is the ultimate warning for any club who wants to put a draftee in the limelight. It can go wrong so quickly and can do so much damage to the club and the player in the long term.